Dag everyone. With your permission, we would like to reschedule a bit. Now we will take the opportunity for the Q&A session with Mark, and then followed by the session with Ken Wilber. And after Ken Wilber, Professor de Blot will give his speech. Okay? Yes, it works. Okay, good. That's it. Good. So, what are the takeaways from the speech? I think a lot. I've written down a few. So, from the speech of Dr. Gaffney, we have gained some insights, like the statement that we are dealing with a crisis of imagination. So we need to re-narrate our view on entrepreneurship, and we need to unleash the infinite potential that each of us have. Another one was that there is a unique self of business, and if we bring that more to the forefront, then we will have entrepreneurs automatically dealing with a higher purpose. So then things such as profit become a byproduct. So we need to go to the core of our creative potential, innovate, build business, not only to reduce the poverty and act on the survival level, but as entrepreneurs, we want also to tap into the second need or the second level of consciousness to link to the sense of belongingness. Another interesting statement was that the opposite views of enlightenment from Eastern and Western traditions, and actually that we need to embrace an enlightenment process where there is room for separating the self, moving to the true self, while at the same time keeping our unique self. And this reminds me of the view of Sri Aurobindo, an Indian philosopher, who said that self-realization is the human aspiration, and without a unique part, there is no self-realization. So I would like to invite Mark and have a Q&A session with you. I think the next 10 minutes or so. Okay?
Short Q&A.
Good.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Who's up?
Yeah.
Just tell us your name.
Sorry, I'm Sonia. Thank
Hi,
you
Sonia.
for your enlightening speech. I was wondering, what do you mean by entrepreneurship? How do you define it? Because it's so broad.
By entrepreneurship, what do I mean? Sonia asks, what do we mean by entrepreneurship? Right, a broad term. So I'm using entrepreneurship in its kind of simple meaning. Entrepreneurship is the creative impulse, right, that seeks to create new value, right, through a creative act, and that value is of service. And particularly, it's of service in one of four ways: to the good, the true, the beautiful, or the heroic. And each one of those is a category. When you actually look at higher purposes of business, businesses either serve, right, the good, the true, the beautiful, or the heroic. And each one kind of falls into a particular category. So that's how I'm defining entrepreneurship, you know, in kind of broad terms, right, for this moment. Thank you. Thank you. Who's next up?
My name is Marcel. I am an entrepreneur. So I lead my business on a day-to-day basis. And tonight I came here and I hear you speak, and I was very inspired by a lot of what you're saying. And at the same time, I feel there's a big gap between the things you're talking about and the leading my business on a day-to-day basis. So I'm looking for a more practical level. What is the first thing I can do tomorrow?
Well, I would say two things. First, we'll address the first thing you can do in your business, which let me see if I can prophetically realize it. Infrastructures. Nice. Nicely done, right? So let me just say two things, right? And this is really critical to understand, that none of this is meta. All of this, you know, is actually tried and tested, and that's why I was talking about particularly outperforming the Jim Collins good to great firms, right? All of this is verified, right, wildly, right, in the bottom line of the marketplace. So it would depend. I can't actually answer the question of what you have to do tomorrow, because I have to know how large your firm is. You're working by yourself. You're not working by yourself. What your core values are. But the first thing, if we sat down to talk, right, I'd say, what are your core values? That'd be my first question. And your core values articulate your mission. Excuse me, your core values articulate your purpose. Your mission is your strategy to get there. And your vision is how will society be changed as a result of you enacting, right, your purpose through your mission. So I would always start with, right, and whenever I talk to a company, is always start with your core values. You have to actually articulate your core values. Your core values actually guide your company and create a ballast, right, and take you where you're going. That's actually step one, core values. Quickly. Who's up next? Thank you. Hi.
And you said there we have a problem like a crisis of imagination.
Right.
Is it not a crisis of trust?
Well, I think that's a great point. I think that's a great point. And it's Cornelius. So I got that.
Cornelius.
Right, says
Repeat.
is it not only a crisis of imagination? Is there also a crisis of trust? And I'm understanding you to say a crisis of trust in business itself, right? And I think the answer is absolutely yes, right? And it's precisely how I began was that we're at an all-time low in terms of our trust of business. So I'll just give you one example: pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals 30 years ago were companies that were actually venerated. Right? These were people who were looking for, right, cures for disease. Right? Today, we've had in the last, I did a little research on this a year ago. In the last decade, there's been about 10 Hollywood blockbuster movies where the villain was an evil pharmaceutical company. Right? And we're all familiar with it. So actually, the trust, right, in pharmaceuticals has gone way down because actually the pharmaceutical companies themselves have lost touch with their unique self, with their higher purpose. And the same thing with the financial sector. Right? The financial sector used to be very highly lauded, but the financial sector, again, right, lost touch with its higher vision. Just give you one example. You all familiar with green mail? Concept of green mail? So green mail essentially means you buy a piece, right, of someone else's company. Let's say you buy up to 5%. You then, by buying 5%, you threaten the company. Right? They have to buy back that 5%. So they buy back the 5%, you make a windfall, but no value was created. No value was created at all. So what you did is you drained the company, right, of resources through green mail. Right? That became common practice, right, in the financial market. I don't know how many of you have heard of Ivan Boesky. Right? Ivan Boesky was kind of, the insider trading scandal in America in the mid-1980s with Drexel Barn and Michael Milken. Anyone familiar? Right? It's a major kind of American story about kind of insider trading. So Ivan Boesky was kind of the key figure, right, in that scandal, and was kind of probably the most important trader, right, in the mid-'80s. So right before this thing broke, right, I was giving a lecture. I was like, 20, and I was giving a lecture at Bear Stearns. It was a major, right, on Jewish sexual ethics, kind of in a different incarnation of my life. So Ivan gets up and he says, Jewish, that's great. Sexual, I'm really good at that. Ethics, not my thing, right? Right? Which was exactly the problem. And that's where green mail came from. So green mail is a classic example, right, of actually losing, right, trust in the financial market. So it's a crisis of trust 1,000%, but it's up to business both to close the gap in those individual places where it needs to regain trust. But what I'm arguing is that the deeper crisis, even deeper than the crisis of trust, which is how it's usually analyzed, is a crisis of imagination. That is to say, to reimagine in the very source code of things what the role of the entrepreneur is. And it's who is our hero. Yes, got the wires. Got you, okay. No stepping on wires.
Can it not so be like a human being has got a soul and a house has got a soul, like my dad learned me when he was a builder, that a company also has a soul?
Well, I wouldn't call it a soul, I'd call it a unique self. But in other words, but we're saying something similar, and that's totally fine. I don't like the language of soul. First, because I've written too many books about it, right? And two is because it's too specific of a religious language, right? And it's not actually translatable into the larger culture, right? So I like unique self because unique self is, right, the essence, right? And you're absolutely right, right? In other words, a company needs to respond to its core values, which are an articulation of its unique self, which you're calling soul, and beautifully. Thank you. Thank you. Yo.
My name is Diederik. And you mentioned that a company or a business can have a unique self. I'm wondering, where does the unique self of a business come from?
That's a great question. That's a fantastic question. Right? Where does the unique self of a business come from? So two things. The unique self of a business initiates, and John Mackey and I have had many conversations about this exact question. it always initiates, right, with the founder. That's where it starts. Right? The founder has a meta vision. And the meta vision, and John did actually a beautiful survey of 50 CEOs who were friends of his in the United States, and it turns out 3 out of the 50, right, started their company driven solely by profit. Right? The other 47 actually had a vision. Right? They had actually a sense of something they wanted to do. Now, what happens is, once the company emerges, you have an evolving unique self. Just like you have an evolving unique self, right, in the human person. What I'm actually drawing is, we don't have time to unpack it now, or it is a structural parallel between the evolution of self and the evolution of a corporation. Because up till now, we all know that a corporation has a legal structure which is protected, right, from outside, right, liability, right, through self-defining itself as a person. But we only use that to protect against liability. I'm saying let's turn that into, right, actually, what's the autobiography of a company? Right, what's its unique self? And its unique self's evolving, and when you actually have stakeholders, when you have not a shareholder model, but a stakeholder model, then actually everyone participates in the evolution of the unique self, even as, right, you also retain kind of a sense of leadership. So we don't lose hierarchy. We lose a dominator hierarchy, and we introduce a holistic hierarchy. There was a lot in that sentence, but it gives at least a meta vision of it. Thank you. Great question. Yo. Yo, by the way, is the opposite of oi. It's like it's an evolution of oi. There we go.
Okay. I think this crisis also is about these first 2 levels to the top 2 levels. So that is exactly what you say, the dominator hierarchy towards the developmental hierarchy. And,
right.
And I think what's needed is the feminine part, adding to the masculine part.
Well, that introduces a big conversation, right? Right? You know what I mean? In other words, yeah, no, and I got it. In other words, I'd say 2 things. The image that we used earlier of the Jedi Knight, as opposed to King Arthur's Knight, right, is precisely the introduction of the feminine. Because the Jedi Knight receives, right, as opposed to thrusts forward. Having said that, right, let's insist, and I think we would all, or most of us would share that we're not talking about, right, gender in terms of men and women. We're talking about masculine and feminine. And as I said to my friend, we're working on a series of books in the think tank, and one of them I'm working on is with Ken, but another one is with a gentleman named John Gray, who wrote a book called Venus and Mars. Remember Venus and Mars? Right, about the masculine and feminine. So John and I are working on a new book now called Beyond Venus and Mars, right? And Beyond Venus and Mars means that the Venus and Mars split, I think, is inaccurate for many reasons. And so actually within every human being, right, there lives a strong Venus and a strong Mars, a strong masculine and a strong feminine. And so it's really about the man, the woman, the human being, society, actualizing these 2 dimensions of its potentiality. Right? We've got to be really careful with the word feminine, right? Because, of course, just one more sentence on it, right? There's a kind of liberal kind of preference for the feminine, right, which I take strong issue with. Right? That is to say, the feminine is beautiful and has shadow. The masculine is beautiful and has shadow. And we need to actually have an empowered evolutionary masculine and hold for the gorgeousness of men, right, as we have a powerful evolutionary feminine and hold for the gorgeousness of the feminine. And you're absolutely correct that we require a heros gamos, that is to say a higher integration of the 2, so completely received. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Chief seats.
Yes, my name is Hanneke, and I heard you saying that to become enlightened, you will have to meditate or pray for a long time or follow a...
Did I say that? That was somebody else.
Anyway, that's what I understood. So I'm wondering, to become a conscious, enlightened organization, what do you have to do?
Great question.
Leaders also have to...
It's a fantastic question. Fantastic question.
Yeah, what the question is, the beautiful question is, right, well, if to become enlightened, you need to meditate and pray for a long period of time, which is how you heard what I said. When I said something close to that, right, then how does actually an organization become enlightened? Do we have prayer services in the corporate boardroom? Right, great question, right? So let me just say 2 things, right? Enlightenment happens in many ways, but enlightenment is not an achieved state. Enlightenment is a process of enlightening. Right? There is no state of enlightenment that you achieve. It's a process of evolution and maturation, of attaining realization and maturity. That's number 1. Number 2, sometimes, rarely, right, there's kind of a gift of grace. right? There's kind of in the old Zen stories. The jug of water breaks, you see the water running, right, and you achieve Satori. That's not generally how it happens. And when it does happen that way, you lose it the next morning. So enlightenment is actually realized, right, through practice. Whatever the practice could be. The practice could be walking in nature. The practice could be, there's a lot of practices that are available. You know, when I teach generally about 20 different paths of practice, right? So there's a lot of practices, right? A company, right, a corporation wakes up when they actually articulate their purpose, right? Identify their unique self, create a corporate culture of integrity, trust, transparency. So you need actually 4 things for a company to enlighten, right? You need conscious leadership, right? You need a conscious culture, right? You need a higher purpose, and you need a stakeholder model and not a shareholder model. Those are the 4 components, and we could talk in a different talk about each one of them is its own talk, but those 4 components are necessary for what we might call an awake company. Okay, let me just do a time check. So I think it's time, we're time, perfect. Okay, apologies. All right, I'm by the way, when we finish, after Dr. DeBlot's, right, important talk, if people want to kind of hang around and ask any of their questions, right, we're delighted to do that. Yeah, now I want to just, as we call, we're about to call Ken, just invite one more thing. That's my email over there. So that email doesn't go to my assistant, that goes to me. So if we don't get to answer questions, it's kind of an ethic I have, and you have a question, or you'd like to contact us, or you'd like to get involved in some way, so just find me at that email, but just say that we met this evening, so I'll kind of know what the context is. So again, if you're interested in getting involved in this whole entrepreneurial revolution, if you're interested in contacting, or you have a question that wasn't answered that we don't get to tonight, you're welcome to contact me. A quick introduction for Ken, friends. So we're about to do a quick call to the United States. We're kind of hoping it goes through. So Ken, very briefly, I'll just introduce him briefly before he gets on the line. He's a close friend, kind of like my big brother, right? He's a great weightlifter, right? He can lift more than I ever can, right? He's an avid, right, reader, right, of books. He devours them. My favorite conversation every week for the last several years is Ken and I get on the line and spend just several hours kind of talking the Dharma, as it were, kind of talking structural thought. Ken is an integral philosopher. He's the leading integral philosopher in the world. He's developed a school of thought called integral philosophy, and he's really done more than almost anyone else alive, right, to create a meta system of thought which actually allows for a vision of what we call the patterns that connect. If I would say it in one sentence, what we share at the Center for Integral Wisdom, and Ken has really led this process and done a gorgeous, gorgeous job, right, is really the basic principle of postmodernity is that there's no grand narrative. Right? The only grand narrative is there's no grand narrative. Right? And what Ken's tried to do in integral thought is to actually reweave a post-dogmatic grand narrative. Right? And it's a meta system of thought. He's done a devastatingly brilliant job of it, and so when he comes on, we'll give him a big hand. You can do better than that. Hey, Mega Pandit.
Hey, buddy, how you doing?
Yo, we're doing okay here. We're in Holland. These are the people who started the slave trade, but they seem to be very nice.
Excellent. Well, it's good to see that they have continued their growth and evolution.
Yeah, these guys are evolving. It's actually an awesome, awesome group of people, and I gave you a huge introduction, and so we're in the middle of Conscious Capitalism, the Integral View, from Mega Pandit, Integral Philosopher. Take it away, Aristotle.
Okay, dokie. Yes, well, I'm going to give a kind of brief rundown of integral business, one version of which conscious capitalism is getting very close to an integral business. And I'm just going to toss out some words, and don't worry if they don't make total sense at the beginning. As we continue to go forward, they'll start to clarify. But an integral business means whole business. And that means business grounded in integral wisdom. And that means including major perspectives, such as the good, the true, the beautiful, and the heroic. And these themselves are anchored in what are often called the quadrants, which are 4 major perspectives or dimensions that any occasion can be looked at with. And these are the inside and the outside of the individual and the collective. And all of those are real, all of those are important. There's also major levels of development. One example is Gene Getzer's archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral. And there are several significant lines of development, what Howard Gardner calls multiple intelligences. So not just cognitive intelligence, but emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and interpersonal intelligence. There's a familiarity with major states of consciousness, such as the meditative states of gross or physical awareness, interior or subtle awareness, causal or infinite formless awareness, and ultimate non-dual awareness, at least accessed in non-dual flow states. There's now compelling research and evidence showing that the more of all of those quadrants, levels, lines, and states that a business leader shows, and correlatively that management shows, the more successful the business is. And in all sorts of categories, from health and sick days of employees, to turnover rate, to job satisfaction, to enthusiastic participation of all stakeholders, including investors, management, staff, suppliers, community, and customers. And finally, to profits. A representative sampling of firms that touched on all or virtually all of those factors over the last 15 years, where Standard & Poor 500 yielded 157% rate of return, these firms produced an astonishing 1,646% rate of return, around 11 times market average. Business today, unfortunately, is far from integral or conscious. And these problems started actually all the way back with modern capitalism itself. Mackey and Sisodia, in their book Conscious Capitalism, maintain that conscious companies include and integrate the good, the true, the beautiful, and the heroic. And according to Max Weber, it was modernity that, for the first time historically on a large scale, differentiated these major value spheres, particularly the good, the true, and the beautiful, and allowed each to proceed on its own path and with its own logic. And this allowed all of them really explosive types of progress and advancement to be made. And among other things, there was the incredible profusion of the modern sciences. Modern physics, chemistry, biology, geology, anthropology, psychology, sociology, and economics all were born essentially in workable forms for the first time. And for around 200 years, these differentiated spheres made enormous progress. At the same time, a liberally educated person was expected to have some awareness of all three, the good, the true, and the beautiful, or ethics, science, and art, and sought to integrate them in a healthy rationality. But eventually, the explosive progress of science led to its domination of virtually all fields considered important. It was also coupled with a philosophy of materialism. And the result, often called scientism or scientific materialism, became the official philosophy of the modern West in everything from sensory empiricism to behaviorism to positivism. All interiors in the eye space or subjective space, including the beauty in the eye of the beholder, consciousness and creativity, and all ethics and morals in the cultural we space or intersubjective space were reduced to only what could be seen with scientific materialism, and what Weber famously called the disenchantment of the world was upon us. Habermas called it the colonization of the life world by science. And this meant that eventually capitalism, which was originally founded by moral philosophers such as Adam Smith, was reduced to materialistic goals and eventually to just merely making profits in much of today's world. Ethics and aesthetics were tossed out the window, consciousness and creativity out the window, purpose, values, morals out the window. All four major dimensions, the good, the true, the beautiful, and the heroic, were reduced to just the true, meaning just objective scientific truth of the exterior of an individual object. No interiors, no eyes, no we's, no morals and ethics, no beauty and goodness, no spirituality, no mind, for that matter. Just exterior, individual, objective facts. Just materialism and money, material capital. The dignity of modernity, which was brought about by the differentiation of the value spheres of the good, the true, and the beautiful, collapsed into the dignity of modernity brought about by the differentiation of the value spheres of the good, the true, and the beautiful, collapsed into the disenchantment of the world and the disaster of modernity, which was caused not by the differentiation of the good, the true, and the beautiful, but the dissociation of the good, the true, and the beautiful, with science winning the war of dissociation and scientific materialism taking over everything from spirituality to ethics to economics. Only the external, individual, objective dimension was real. No interiors, again, no eyes, no we's, no consciousness, no culture, no beauty, no morals. And business followed suit, and it too often began generating and attracting greed, lust for money, power, dominance. To make a fairly long story, as short as I can, the evolution of consciousness and culture, though officially ignored or denied, nonetheless continued. And as it moved from rational stages to the pluralistic stages, these previously dismissed dimensions began to be recognized again. This meant that the predominant theory of business and management previously, which was eventually known as Theory X, which focused solely on exterior object production and the exterior behavior driving it, started to exist alongside three other major theories: examining and including the interior of the individual, the subjective dimension, including individual meaning, beauty, values, purpose, and happiness, was called Theory Y. And it started to demonstrate that when businesses took these areas into account, their performance almost always increased, often dramatically. Examining and including the interior of the group or collective, that is the intersubjective we space or business culture, so-called culture management, became the rage starting a few decades ago. And again, studies often consistently showed that companies that consciously addressed and managed their cultures did significantly better in profits as well. This third quadrant or dimension was as significant as the other two. And finally, looking at the exteriors of the collective group or system by using system theory, produced approaches that also resulted in more effective, more efficient business practices, also including increased profits when done well. This heroic dimension, heroic in the sense of including all objective exteriors in a functional fit, was also important. So today we stand with these four fundamental dimensions: the true, the beautiful, the heroic, and the good, or the outside and inside of the individual and the collective, the world of the I, the world of the we, the it, or individual objects, and the its, or systems of objects. And each of those driving a major theory of business and business practice: theory X, theory Y, culture management, and system theory management. But the evolution of all of these dimensions continues. And we are now, today, on the verge of moving from pluralistic level to the integral level. And that is driving an entirely new theory of economics, business, and business practice, namely one that includes and integrates all of these major dimensions, as well as significant factors in each of them, such as levels, lines, and states. That is integral business as it is starting to emerge today. Thus, Mackey and Sisodia include all four quadrants: the good, the true, the beautiful, and the heroic, and they discuss it that way. They talk about each, and they recommend practices for each, and go into that in some detail. They include numerous lines, including cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and systems intelligence. And they also discuss each of those and recommend those and practices for them, explain why it's made a difference, and why virtually all of these factors were included in the firms that Sisodia examined in his book called Firms of Endearment, which showed that the companies that include all these factors produce rates of return of over 11 to 1 average market return. They also recognized growth or levels in each of those lines or intelligences. They include stakeholder integration across the board: investors, staff, leadership, suppliers, customers, community, and environment. And three important dimensions of the interior I and we, which they call higher purpose and core values, conscious leadership, and conscious culture and management. And of course, all of this is emphasizing as well creativity and entrepreneurship, as I'm sure Mark has explained. A group, and I'm just taking some examples of some of the approaches to integral business that are starting to show up. There's a book recently released called Coherence by Alan Watkins and his group in England. And they have specifically used an aqua model, all quadrant, all level, all lines, all states, all types. And they say this: since 2010, I and my colleagues have successfully road tested this model with 450 global CEOs, including 7% of the FTSE 100, the best CEOs in India and China, plus luminaries in the Fortune 500. We wanted to determine whether they were thinking about anything that is not included in this new model of leadership. They are not. As a result, we share this model extensively with clients and encourage them to think about the challenges they are facing in terms of the four quadrants. The simple reality is that if we don't realize that our efforts in the rational, objective world are built on the individual I, physiology, emotions, feelings, and thoughts, and that the success of what we want to build requires our connectivity at the interpersonal we, then we've no solid foundation on which to build effectiveness in the solid, rational world of it, or exterior individual objects, products. So the best leaders, and there are very few, move effortlessly between and are coherent across all four quadrants. And that requires vertical development or levels across a number of different lines of development. The lines they happen to include, and again, I'd like to emphasize that there are any number of different lines, any number of different ways of looking at lines. So there's several different types of lines that can be included. And research is continuing to sort out which are the most important. They include 8 lines, including physiology, emotions, cognitive, maturity, values, behavior, networks, and impact. And they say the enlightened leader must have sufficient altitude across all 8 of these specific business-centric lines of development as a fast-track route to business transformation. And they then discuss these 8 lines, moving through 12 levels of development. And the notion that these multiple lines all move to the same levels was first introduced by integral theory, and we believe that there continues to be significant evidence for that approach. And the 12 levels that they include are variations on the levels that I generally use, which again can be presented in several different ways. One of the ways is the Getzer levels that I talked about: archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral, and then some third tier or higher levels, including paramind, metamind, overmind, and supermind. The point is we're continuing to get research coming in using different models of development, and there are several dozen. They all essentially show similar levels, but they're doing so in different lines. So again, we have different lines, same levels. And research is continuing to show that leaders that are more developed in more of these lines consistently do better in all sorts of categories, and not just success or productivity, although profits are included, but in terms of interpersonal functioning, capacity to communicate, effectiveness in terms of leadership, and so on. So what we're finding increasingly is that all of these dimensions of the human being that were effectively ruled out of existence by an over-dominating scientific materialism are increasingly starting to come back online. And we're starting to find these showing up in the world of business as well. And business is starting to return to more of its moral foundations and recognizing that it has been the single greatest force in the alleviation of poverty ever conceived by human beings. And so what we're simply suggesting is that the more comprehensive, the more whole, the more integral the business becomes, which means the more conscious it is of all of these various dimensions of a human being in all of its various stakeholders, that the more effective the business is going to be. And we are now actually talking about businesses as a way not just to produce a product making money, but to produce growth, development, and evolution in its stakeholders, including, of course, its own staff and management. And so business work is going to increasingly become a place where people go to grow, to develop, to grow up, to wake up, to clean up, to show up. And this is astonishing, particularly given the path that business slipped into in the wake of the dissociation of modernity and the increasingly rather poor public perception of business as a whole. In polls, at least in many Western countries, individuals involved with business are ranked quite low in terms of their perceived morals, values, and purpose. And what we're consistently finding is that just the opposite is actually occurring in the most successful companies, the ones that include purpose and morals and values and creativity and consciousness and growth and development in their own awareness are turning out to be the companies that are also, as a byproduct, more successful. And as you think about it, of course, it starts to make sense, because the creation of a product is not just a happenstance occurrence. Somebody has to come up with a creative act, and then go through an extraordinary series of processes in order to create a business that can create that product or that service, bring it to people who want it or need it, and as a byproduct make money doing so. And so business is really a creator and a font of value. And that's, in a sense, one of the most important things that business does, is create value for its stakeholders, including its customers. And a value-producing mechanism is an astonishing mechanism. We have very, very few of those types of mechanisms in human life. And so, far from being ranked low on the scale of values and morals and purposes and goals, the better businesses today are, objectively speaking, in the higher ranks of those categories. And that's what makes them so astonishing. And that's what is making business a genuine leading edge of the evolution of human consciousness itself, and therefore human culture. So this is putting it in an extraordinarily different category than the too often perceived category of it has one legal and moral goal only, and that is to make profit for its investors. That turns out to be an incredibly narrow description of what it's actually doing. And by paying attention to what it's actually doing, then it can do it better. It can do it more consciously. It can do it more integrally. And so that's why business is actually, as evolution itself, is starting to move into these radically different domains of integral levels of development. Business itself is starting to step into a radically extraordinary capacity and functioning. And so this is why it's become so exciting to study business. And it's why business itself has become such an exciting leading edge of evolution and value creation and sources of creativity and aesthetics, and all while pursuing moral and ethical ends. This is rather extraordinary. So I am just delighted to be part of this larger discussion where we are discussing these kinds of ideas and where we are all working towards them one way or another. It's an extraordinary period to be involved with a business in almost any capacity. So thank you all very much for being here. Thank you very much for asking me to say a few words. I wanted to keep them brief and just try to give an indication of what's happening on the whole and how exciting the entire field of business is becoming at this point in history. So thank you all. Bless you very much.
Ken, thank you very much. A huge hand. Thank you very, very much.
We will give the floor to Paul. I don't think I need to introduce Paul. I only want to say that he may be the oldest professor in the world working in his field till today.
Thank you very much. After the very interesting talks of Ken Wilber and you, Mark, I can also only give you some reflection. And I will reflect on 4 words. The main question was, who are you? The second conclusion was consciousness. And it was a process as a story of consciousness in doing business. Perfect. But how did this story start? The story, our story, is a part of the big story of the whole world, what we call the evolution. Whole the world, whole our creation was started as a very simple material world. The first step was a material world, without any sustainability, without any consciousness, only a world coming up and falling down. The second step of this story was the world of the living beings, plants and animals. These beings created a quite new life. And the material world was becoming the material, the tool for this life in the DNA. The DNA formula are a composition of material elements of the material world, which the material world was elevated, taken over, and integrated in the world of life, animals and plants. What happened in this world? This world was directed to sustainability, to sustain. The plants with the seeds, animal with the small animals, newborn living beings. But all this nature was directed by the sustainability. And the sustainability was not only sustainability of one element, one animal, one plant, no, of the whole world, a network of sustainability, an ecological network, but without consciousness. Then the third step, the step of the consciousness, the human being was born. Humanization of the whole world. What does it mean, humanization? That the animal, with an animal life, were becoming a human being with a consciousness. The consciousness is the typical characteristic of human beings, the consciousness. What does it mean, consciousness? That the human being is conscious of his history, conscious of his participation of the whole world, conscious that he is a part of the history, of the big history of the world. Human beings are participations of the big world on a unique way. Unique. For every human being, the process is unique. as a process of conscientization, a process of self-leadership, a process of growing conscious that you are a part of the whole world. You are conscious that everything has to do with everything. Everything is connected with everything. You are a part of the whole system. But what happened? The sustainability is not automatically going on. The human being got the freedom to accept it or not, to agree or not, to sustain the sustainability or refuse it. He can say no or yes. Is it useful? Is it meaningful to continue or not? And you can make the choice no. You can decide with the choice no, I don't continue this story in my life. And that's happened now in the world. The meaningless processes of human people, the meaningless processes of entrepreneurship, the meaningless processes of doing business not at the level of yes, I continue, or no, I refuse this evolution history. You can make in freedom your own history. You can decide in freedom your own history based on your consciousness. Is it meaningful or not for me? For me, I don't think about others. But if you are saying, agreeing, it's meaningful for me in your deepest self, then you make a decision. It's also meaningful for all the rest of the world, for everybody and everything. And it's a consciousness based on the self, your self, as Kat Wilber said, it's your self. Yourself, which is becoming conscious in your life story. Yourself is becoming conscious in the story of yourself in connection with the whole world, with everything, with everybody. And that is the meaning of conscious capitalism. You can use money, you can use the capital as a tool, but also as a goal. If you use the capital as a goal, then you make your own life a tool. What happened? The consciousness of the meaningfulness of your life is lost because you are changing. The goal of your life, the purpose of your life, the dream of your life is made a tool, only a tool. And the tool of the material success, the tool of the material world is becoming a goal. Material world will not sustain, will collapse. And so you help the collapsing of the world with this change of tools and goals. So consciousness is conscious, to be conscious that your life is a goal. The only goal is your own life in connection with the whole world. And everything what you use as a capital is only a tool, not more as a tool. And that's the conclusion of conscious capitalism. Thank you.
Are there questions to Paul or Mark? Any questions for Paul or Mark? I have one question. Okay. For? Mark.
Maybe for Paul too, I don't know.
Yeah?
It's 20 minutes out.
I have a question for Mark.
Oh.
Mark, what do you see as the relationship between your vision, your narrative of business, and the narrative of business of Ayn Rand, which is in a way also a positive narrative, but in a way not a narrative that doesn't speak very much to me?
It's a great question. Before we do that, though, I just have to say how much I enjoyed listening to Professor de Blot, both in terms of the content, just the awesome content, and the spirit, just the presence and the spirit, and it's very rare. I just want to say this, it's very rare that you actually get to be in the presence of, you know, a true Yoda, a true master, you know? And I'm just honored and delighted. Just really completely honored and delighted. Really. Completely honored and delighted. You know, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Ayn Rand. Yeah. Hold on one second.
Oh.
I'll go for that one. Go for that one? We're good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So Ayn Rand, how many people have read Ayn Rand? Okay. So notice one thing about the Ayn Rand vision, which kind of cracks it open, right? In the Ayn Rand books, there are no children. It's very powerful. You actually get the whole story, right? No, people, there's no children, meaning she's constructed a universe, right, without dependency, without vulnerability, and actually what she does is she caricatures, right, dependency. She caricatures vulnerability and then creates a kind of Nietzschean archetype, right, of creativity. But her creativity is purely masculine. And in this sense, your beautiful comment before, it's a creativity which lacks, right, a kind of awakened feminine. And that's, of course, Ayn Rand's great mistake, right? She's operating from a flatland perspective. That is to say, it's denuded of depth. That is to say, it's denuded of interiors. And precisely what Ken and I are trying to argue for, right, is the reclaiming of a four-quadrant model in which actually interiors and exteriors, right, are both playing and dancing in dialectical tension. Ayn Rand, if you would put it in our system, in a quadrant system, she's the ultimate expression of the reification, right, the deification of the right-hand quadrants, that is the exterior of the collective and the exterior primarily of the individual. And in that sense, right, she's actually, you know, sorely lacking in terms of a potential vision. So that's the Ayn Rand question. Yo, anyone else? No, maybe. Good, okay.
Thank you. My name is Mees. I got a reflection that's also connected to this. I missed a certain dimension that touches a lot of subjects, I think, and it's the emotional dimension. And I would like to reflect, the both of you, please, also what the impact is of the whole digitalization of our society.
The emotional dimension. I distinguish three levels. The hardware is the structures. The software is the soul. But then you have the hardware. the organization where between the hardware and the software. And the software is the mentality, the mind. In this mind you have feelings, you have some internal, yeah, you can say intuitions, but it's not the inner feeling of your soul. It's not the spiritual feeling. The spiritual feeling is the inner hardware and the inner software. So between you have a whole scala of feelings, emotions, etc., etc. And I call it the orgware. And there's a mixture. You can say no, not a mixture. It's between hardware and software, between the connection to integrate these two.
And how do you see that technological development in how we communicate with each other and influences on this level?
Yeah. It's always a mix, but you can distinguish very sharply. We are a composition of processes, from top down, bottom up, bottom. So there's always a mix. But the inner feeling, the spiritual feeling, the consciousness, is very clear. It's giving you an inner rest, an inner consolation, an inner peace, what they call shalom. The inner shalom, that is the inner feeling that you are on the level of being in connection with everything.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, thank you. Let me kind of take it. So thank you, Dr. de Blot. Let me kind of pick it up from a different perspective, building on what Paul said. So particularly I want to talk about the digital world, right, that you talked about, right? And the gentleman talks about the kind of increasing digitalization of reality. And of course, everything Paul said stands, so I'm not going to repeat that in a different way. Let me kind of take it from a different perspective. So I want to introduce a new term, which is another one of the, one of the books I'm working on now. I've got a few too many of them, but this one is called digital intimacy, right? Digital intimacy, right? And it actually approaches the digital world, right, and tries to turn it on its head. So let me just give you, I'm going to do it in a kind of very simple way, right? We assume that the digital world is a dehumanizing world. That's kind of the given assumption, right? Face to face, that's real, right? That's powerful, right? Digital, right, is somehow lacking true virtue, right? The virtual is without virtue. But actually, if you actually feel into it, the virtual is a neutral territory that can actually be, right, positively hijacked for intimacy. You can actually create new possibilities of digital intimacy, and instead of writing another book complaining about the alienation of the digital, which is upon us. So complaints, right, about the alienation of the digital are actually not that helpful, right, because it's the reality we're living in, right? A better question would be, right, how do you turn fate into destiny and invite the possibility, right, of digital intimacy? So I'm just going to give you one small example in extremely practical terms. And again, because Paul talked about the meta so beautifully, I'm freed from, right, responding on that level because you've gotten a beautiful response. Let me kind of take it to this level. So how many people here have ever made a Skype call? Call on Skype. Okay, good. So if you go online and you see kind of issues with Skype calls, there's an entire virtual literature on the problems in a Skype call. Besides connectivity, it's impersonal, it's problematic, right? There's a whole list of problems with Skype calls. Let's see if we can, in 2 minutes, turn that around, okay? Just turn it on. Just turn it on. We try and arrange that. We try and arrange that. Well done. By the way, the person who was calling, I just have to say the person who was calling was Swami Durgananda, Sally Kempton, who's kind of the premier yoga teacher in the world of yoga philosophy. We could have put her online, and I'm not sure she would have appreciated it. Right? So you've done a Skype call. That was hilarious, right? The Lord is with us. So you've done a Skype call. Now watch for a second. It's very beautiful. What happens in a Skype call besides the alienation? Let's now turn it around. Let's create the 5 sacred principles of Skype. Ready? 1, you're in the frame with a person. So instead of a usual conversation where there's all sorts of diffuse energy, actually you're both in a frame, right, that allows actually for a different level of communication because there's a level of focus that's not available, number one. Number two, in a Skype call, you can actually switch perspectives. What does that mean? Normally, right, we're having a conversation. So we're having a conversation, you know, Shahad and I. There's Shahad right there, right, sitting in the front. So we're having a conversation. So if we're having a conversation, the only thing I can see is, right, Shahad's face, and she can see my face. But I can't see how she sees me. So I can't take her perspective. Paradoxically, on a Skype call, if you look at the little box, right, you actually can switch perspectives, and I can actually experience the way Shahad is looking at me. So a Skype call actually offers, right, on a second level, a new invitation to intimacy. 3, try and have a conversation in which you're in the middle of the conversation and you go like this. You're talking to the person, you go like this. I don't want to see you anymore, just keep talking. See how far you get in your business deal. It's just somehow not polite in society to cover up your face, or try it a different way. Have a conversation with the person and cover up their face, right, while you're talking to them. It just doesn't go. Now, on Skype, you actually have that option. You can actually turn your camera on and off, which actually allows you to move between the intimacy of voice and the intimacy of face, which are two different qualities of intimacy, in a way that's fully unavailable in a classical conversation. Number 3. Number 4. The fourth thing you can do is you can introduce a new dimension, right? You can introduce writing, right? Imagine you're talking to someone and you're passing them notes, right, as you're talking to them. It's a rather strange thing to do, probably in need of some sort of, you know, medical intervention, right? However, right, when you're using Skype, what do you get to do? You actually, right, can actually jot a few words so that actually you kind of send them a kind of punctuation, right, of the conversation, which is completely unavailable. Now just look what we just did. It's kind of shocking. And there's no conversation about this anywhere in the world, so it so, you know, annoyed me, right, on an intellectual level. When I read book after book about people complaining about the digital world, I said, really? Like another one of these books? So I said, well, how can we turn this around? Digital intimacy. Right, digital intimacy invites a new possibility. Let's just go one more step, one more step, and one more step. We're just going to go for 4. We're going to leave the 5 for your imagination, but let's just go one more intellectual step, okay? Let's go one more intellectual step. So I want to make the following suggestion, and it's actually it's a powerful suggestion. I don't have time to unpack it now, but let me just kind of give it in 2 images, right? 1 from kind of intellectual theory, and 2 from, you know, the world of cultural images in a movie. Here's the intellectual theory, right? There's an assumption, right, which is a beautiful assumption, as Dr. de Blot laid out so beautifully, that we start with the physiosphere, the physical world, then we go to the biosphere, the biological world, then we move to the noosphere, as, right, Dr. de Blot's teacher and colleague Nijenrode pointed out so beautifully. And that's, of course, completely true. That's a complete given. But let me introduce a new possibility. What if the split between those was much less than we thought it was? Right? What if actually there's sentience? You know what I mean by the word sentience? There's sentience, there's life all the way up and all the way down. What if we actually begin to realize that the self-organizing principles, right, are actually at play, right, at the very inception of the Big Bang, and they only become conscious of themselves in a way that's accessible, right, at a higher level, but actually all the way up, all the way down, we're dealing with sentience. Now I'll just give you an image. Here's an image. So Ken and I have a good friend, right, named Larry Wachowski, who's a movie maker, right? I met actually Larry through Ken. He's now Lana Wachowski. He actually went through a beautiful, right, and holy operation, which was very, you know, key to his own perception of gender, right? So Lana Wachowski. And Lana made a movie called The Matrix, right? Now, at the end of Matrix 3, right, there's a great scene. How many people saw the Matrix movies, or any of them? So at the end of Matrix 3, there's this great scene in which actually Neo, right, is in this kind of crucifixion scene. He's kind of lifted up. So if you really get what's happening in the Matrix, and I spent a long night talking to Lana, trying to explain his movie to him, which seemed to need to be done, right? Right? No, actually, he got it perfectly. I'm just teasing him, right? Actually, what you realize is that the machines are alive. That's the entire point of the Matrix. That actually the split between Babylon, right, the world that splits between the human world and the machine world, is actually a false split. And actually, if you read Ray Kurzweil's work, or if you read any of the people talking about the singularity, however you interpret the singularity, what's certainly true is, right, is that that very sharp split between the inanimate and the animate, right, is a split that I believe in the next 100 years will be challenged, right, in a significant way. So the place to start is with digital intimacy, right, to actually enliven, right, that world, right, instead of bemoaning it. And I think that's where we need to go in general. We take fate, right, we turn it into destiny. Okay. Last question? Last question. Make it good.
Hi, I'm Edwin Janssen. I've heard you talk about human needs with regards to Maslow. One of the problems that we face in our world is that we try to satisfy so many human needs. Maybe the needs are also marketed needs and not just fundamental human needs. So in what way do you think with your whole framework of thinking you could address that with marketed needs, the problem that we actually create with that?
What's the difference between different kinds of needs? How do we distinguish?
Yeah, fundamental human needs, Max Neef on one hand and Maslow on the other side.
Please, Paul first, I'll answer afterwards. Do you have a microphone?
Yeah, yes, but I didn't.
What's the difference?
Hear the question?
The question was, how do we distinguish between real human needs and needs that are created by marketing?
What is the difference, the real need and the artificial need? Is that the question? Okay. You have, on the level of doing, you have the marketing need. On level of doing, you can control it with your eyes, with your ears, with your brains. It's controlled. And that is on the level of your ratio. That is the outside evidence. You have also an inside evidence. And the inside evidence is not controlled by external instruments. You can't measure it. You can see it, you can't hear it, but you feel it. But this feeling is a certainty which cannot be proved by a rational argumentation. It's an inner feeling. For instance, a mother is feeling, my daughter is sick. Are you sick, Mary? No. Yes, you are sick. They go to the doctor, she is sick. How does the mother know? How does the mother know that the daughter is sick? Inner feeling. So you have an inner evidence and an external evidence. The external evidence is the basis for doing business, for calculations, for leadership, external leadership. But the internal evidence is the internal certainty, is the consciousness, the conscious certainty, the conscious leadership of yourself. That's the consciousness. And this consciousness is from the inner life, from your heart, and cannot be calculated, explained by your brains. You feel it. I cannot give more arguments.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So let me just pick up on that. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And again, kind of emerging, right, and working with, Paul's answer and kind of taking it not to the next stage, but from a different dimension, from a different perspective. And we'll kind of finish here. Okay? So the question you ask is, which again, Dr. de Blot, addressed so beautifully, is how do we distinguish between authentic needs, right, and manufactured needs? And it's a great question, right, because in a culture in which we're inundated by marketing, I remember, I don't know what kind of candy bars you have in the Netherlands, but when I grew up, right, okay, so when I grew up, there were basically 3 candy bars. There was 3 Musketeers, you could get a regular Nestle's chocolate bar, maybe a Baby Ruth bar. Those were kind of the 3 major candy bars in the United States. You walk into any United States store today, you've got about 200 different kinds of candy bars, right? Now, we're not adding a lot of value to society, but what we're doing is we're manufacturing needs. We're creating a slightly different taste and creating a virtual addiction, right? Coke. Coke is it, right? Right? It's kind of the new credo, right? Everywhere, right? And it's, you got to create a kind of addictive need in all sorts of ways. So what you're asking beautifully is, right, is how do you discern between your authentic needs, right, and your pseudo needs, or between what I like to call authentic eros, right, and pseudo eros. If you can kind of track the distinction. So let me just kind of offer something very, very simple as a beautiful way to close. The real question, and really what you're speaking to essentially is, and what Paul spoke to so beautifully now is, what motivates a human being, right? What makes you kind of get out of bed, right, in the morning, right? How do you do it? What makes you get out of bed, right? And that's kind of everything. Do you get out of bed because you want to actually fulfill your survival needs? For sure. Of course you do. But actually there's something much, much deeper. And if we could maybe go back, right, to the beginning, because the beginning is in the end and the end is in the beginning. If you're still lonely, right, call Lola. There's a core human need to move beyond alienation to connection, from separation to integration, right, from loneliness to loving. And that essential human need, right, is to be received. And the only way that a person can be liberated from loneliness, right, what Milton called the human being's real condition, is to be fully recognized and received. And we as human beings are systematically misrecognized. To move beyond loneliness is to be able to share your irreducible uniqueness, if you will, not your fingerprint, but to borrow your term, your soul print with another human being. And so I want to just finish, and we've got about 1 minute to kind of close this hall, and I'm sure there's all sorts of kind of issues. So I'm going to finish just to leave you with this image. I'm going to really kind of finish on a personal note, right, as opposed to kind of a meta note. So I have a son named Eitan, who's actually coming to visit me early tomorrow morning, and we're going to spend 4 days kind of hiking through Holland with his brother Yair. So I'm kind of ecstatic, right, to kind of see him tomorrow morning. And many, many years ago, I was on my way to Sweden for a lecture tour. And, you're kind of 22 years old, and you kind of think that whatever you have to say is kind of obviously unbelievably important. So you're kind of very kind of, focused on everything you're doing. So as I walked out of the house, Eitan, right, gives me, right, a kind of shoebox. And he says in Hebrew, he says, Abba, kach et ze itcha. He says, Dad, take this with you. So I kind of grabbed the shoebox. I put it in my bag of Aramaic texts, right, and off I went. 3 weeks later, back from Sweden, I walk into our little apartment. I was living at that time in Jerusalem, right, and he looks at me, and I look at him, and I didn't even have time to lie, right? In other words, his shoebox was kind of at the bottom of this large bag of books. I'd been so intent, I just didn't look at it, and I felt like it wasn't like worth being born. He's got a little tear running down his cheek, and I say, Eitan, afshar od chance? Like, could I have another chance? And so I go to our little red Subaru, and I get out the shoebox, and I open the shoebox, and in the shoebox is the door handle of our first apartment in Jerusalem, which I never knew where that went. There was my silver cross pen, I don't know if you remember those, kind of the pen I used to write with. There's an old faded picture of his mother from the Palm Beach paper, and his stuff. And he looks at me and he says in Hebrew, he says, Abba, zeh dvarim sheli, natati lecha velo kibalta. He says, Dad, that's my stuff. I gave it to you, right? You didn't receive it. And of course, we've done much better since, but I realized in that moment, in answer to your question, we all have our stuff, right? There's a poem that we all want to Well, we want to read that poem. There's a song that only we can sing, a poem only we can write. There's a way of living, laughing, loving, being in the world that's ours and ours alone. To be lonely is to be unable to share that with another person. To be fully realized is to be connected, to be integrated, to be recognized. That's a true need. Thank you, everyone, very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you. Beautifully said. Thank you. So we will be closing now, and there will be a farewell drinks. And I will ask Paul to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharda. Mark, thank you very much for your wonderful exposure. Thank you. I like also to thank you, Sharda, for your traffic control of our discussions. Mark Pieper, I thank you very much also for your assistance during the talk of Mark, Van Can Wilber, and all the assistants you supported us with the success of this meeting. I'd like also to thank Peter Michelson and his assistants, Ricardo and Joep, of the technical service for sound and all the technical service we need during this session. Thank you very much. The events and the catering who also give the service we need so that we have you can enjoy this meeting. And we thank also very much Format Catering and the events. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you very much, Jacqueline van Ermel, with your team, service, and everybody. I thank you very much. That I hope you can enjoy this evening. Thank you, Paul. And I enjoy. Thank you, thank you, thank you.